Ready? This is on. We are streaming. Yep. Okay. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Okay. First, I want to thank everyone for your flexibility. When I announced that Adult Ed was going to be on Wednesday, I thought I might hear a few grumblings because Sunday morning is just so darn convenient for us. We've got children's church school going on and people are here. There's a couple of reasons why I decided to make the change, and I hope it's self-evident, but probably the most important one is that it enables us to grow and expand what we're doing. I'm very limited in terms of juggling in my own mind Sunday morning if I've got an entire class in my head and a homily in my head, and I'm trying to juggle all that. It very much, it's been a kind of a cross for me because that's the way that I prepare. If this isn't sort of already evident, it's not like I have a sermon all written out and memorized and I just kind of go on autopilot when I come to deliver my sermon. It's very much born out of a struggle that begins earlier in the week and intensifies very early Sunday morning while I'm lying in bed, and that the sermon emerges. It's very much like a birth process for me, not to get too graphic here, but it's very much, it's like an eruption. And when I have to erupt on the lecture for the church school, for the adult church school, and like keep that in my pocket for the homily, it's very, very difficult. It's really a cross, and I was doing that for the last 2 years because I felt that it was the right thing to do and the appropriate thing to do. But hopefully this works. It's good to see everybody out here on a Wednesday evening. It's good that we can stream this so that people at home can watch it either now or at their leisure. So the title of what we're going to be doing over the next 8 weeks is Liturgical Ethics, Eucharistic Morality. So I want to explain that title a little bit. First of all, ethics and morality. We live in an intensely moral period of time. Intensely moral. We also live in a very strangely moral period of time. It is intense and it is very, very strange. St. Paisios, and I believe other fathers, have said that the day would come when the world would lose its mind and they would call what was good evil and they would call what is evil good. You cannot ask moral questions or ethical questions in our current environment without being struck by just how righteous everybody is, by the moral weight of their convictions. There probably was a time, at least in our imagination, that when you think of things like morality or ethics or the culture wars, there's people who want to do good things, and there's people who obviously want to do bad things. And what they really want is just the freedom to do bad things. But that's not the battle we face at all. People that want to do what we consider to be destructive things really do believe that what they're doing is good. That what they're doing is liberation. What they're doing is kindness. What they're doing is freedom. And oftentimes, we are the ones who appear immoral. We are the ones who appear to have an evil streak in us. Why do you want to be bad? Why do you want to be mean? Right? And how we think of these things in terms of ethics and morality very much depends then on what our understanding of the goals of life are. And basically, the point I'm making by saying that we live in a strangely, intensely moral period of time is that when you change your orientation, when you change your understanding of what the end goal is, you end up with funny ethics. You end up with off-color morality. And things that were once obviously immoral to everybody now seem to be righteous. And things that were obviously righteous now seem to be a kind of disease. That's the age we live in. And it hits all of us. And I can promise that this is going to be a sort of equal opportunity class for offense. I hope so. Or at the very least, that we will all feel uncomfortable at times. We will all feel challenged at times, that we have made assumptions for our own lives, for our children's lives, for our grandchildren's lives, for our neighbors' lives, for our godchildren, their lives. We've made assumptions that we haven't thought all the way through, and we're going to have to confront the fact that when we don't have a true Christian orientation, we can start to believe things that we know the church says we ought to not believe, but we don't know why. And this is also, I think, one of the main reasons for this class. The question that we are getting more and more is, Father, I'm with my significant other. We're in a completely committed relationship. We're not going to get married for several years. We can't because of school or finances or circumstances, but we're totally committed and we both consent. So why is it so wrong for us to have a physical sexual relationship? And the question is sincere. Many young people today don't know why that would be wrong. It's an interesting question. Why would that be wrong? Because it's actually a very philosophical question. And it's also a very liturgical question, which I'll come to in a moment. What they're really asking is, why is mutual consent not the philosophical framework that the church uses to determine what is good or what is not good? What is healthy, what is not healthy? What can be sanctified by access to the chalice, the body and blood of Christ, and what cannot be? Here we get to the liturgics, and I'll get to that in a moment. In other words, it's not just a case of we both want to do it, we're both totally fine with it, we don't feel like we're hurting anybody, we don't feel bad for doing it, we don't feel that God feels bad about us doing it. It just feels totally right and natural to us. So what could possibly be the problem? Well, that is why we're here. That is why we're here. We're going to be answering that, but hopefully in a sensitive way, because I think in the past, the church, sometimes we've rested on our laurels, and we've gotten to assume like, oh, we still live in this Christendom world, and we can just say this is right and that's wrong, and everybody stay in the lines, and that's it. But we can't do that. We can't do that because it's all gotten flipped upside down. When we look at something like gender reassignment surgery, which in one age might be considered a form of self-mutilation, why is that right or why is that wrong? Because the people who think it's right really think it's right. And that's what I mean by we live in an immoral age. When people want to promote that and say this is the way for people struggling with gender dysphoria to finally have a decent life, to finally have their place and their identity, they really believe that this is a moral, righteous thing to do. And those who suggest that it is something like self-mutilation look like monsters. We look like the bad guys, okay? So we have to be sensitive to that. We don't want to be bad guys, and we don't want to look like bad guys, but we often, when we talk about things, we're not going to assume, I'm going to make this promise, I'm not going to assume that anyone agrees with anything that we talk about here. I'm going to assume that we are a neutral group. We are coming at these things from a lot of different angles, and some of us are going to have different opinions about some of the things we're going to talk about. And again, hopefully that will be righteously uncomfortable. Was it Father John Kowalczyk the other week who said our job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right? So that's what we have to do. Where we're comfortable, we need to feel a little afflicted, at least for compassion's sake, at least for love's sake, at least for the sake that we live in a world that is vastly confused. And when even our own Orthodox young people really don't know, like they might vaguely know what to do in various situations regarding their bodies and how they act with their bodies, but they often, far too many don't know why. And too many don't have the tools and the skills to know how to handle the freedom. And as we'll see, we'll get to this really in our first, well, I'll explain the framework of how we're going to do this because we need a structure to do this. But let me just say as a sort of precursor, many of our young people, especially our teenagers, have too much of the wrong kind of freedom and too little of the right kind of freedom. The problem is not that they don't need freedom. The problem is they need the right kind of freedom. The problem is not that they need more structure. The problem is they need the right kind of structure. And we often make decisions for our children, again, grandchildren, etc., where we structure them in ways that almost set them up to be confused. That's the world we live in. And we have to tell the story. I'm going to, a little bit here, tell the story of how that happened. But let me just sort of lay out what we're going to do then. Tonight, I really want to give some background to the meaning of the word bioethics. We do have some medical personnel in our midst, and that's a very interesting, very recent term, bioethics. As you can imagine, it deals with the ethics of biology. And so bioethics is really a kind of hospital framework, a hospital matrix when we think about very difficult medical procedures, a very difficult end of life or beginning of life scenarios. Bioethics emerges as a way to try to think about that. But what we're going to do is give some of the background to how we got to here. And then we're going to lay out two frameworks. One framework is to make sure we understand what we mean by a Christian teleology, and I'll explain that in a moment. And also then I'm going to lay out the framework of how we're going to look at moral, ethical questions liturgically. And I'll pick up, I want to keep moving here so I don't get too far behind, but I'll pick up why liturgics as we go. First of all, obviously, when we start talking about ethics, we start talking about morality, we also think of the culture wars. And again, one of the temptations of the culture wars is to think, oh, the culture wars happened because some people suddenly wanted to do bad things, and again, they just sort of pushed their agenda onto the rest of us, and now we're fighting to keep righteous lines in place, and they're fighting to do what they want. That's not where they came from. And that's also not where bioethics came from. Bioethics is an interesting term. Really don't start seeing the word bioethics until about the 1970s out of Georgetown Medical School. And there's a reason for it, and I'm gonna kind of give a whirlwind tour here, but I think it's really, really helpful for us to have our bearings on where some of our current conflicts and confusion come from. And it actually begins with a story from the Reformation, to be honest with you. And I have to be brief here, so forgive me, but we're just going to fly. In the Reformation, you have the sudden surge of use of reason in theology, reason in biblical interpretation. And in the first generation of Reformation thinkers, think of Luther, think of Calvin, think of Zwingli, you have different traditions almost instantly gathering up and breaking away from Western Roman Catholic Christianity, all right? We all know the basic contours of the Protestant Reformation. There were people like Luther who decided they didn't like things about the Roman Catholic Church. He posted the 95 Theses. This is what's wrong. And it sparks, in some ways, an unintended but a very powerful movement away from the Catholic Church and a splintering of the West in terms of their theology and their philosophy. And the reason why this is important for us to consider right now is that the first generation of reformers really had a faith in reason. They had a faith that if they looked reasonably at what the scriptures say and looked reasonably at history, they would come to the same conclusion about what Christianity really does and does not teach, and how Christians really should live, what is moral, what is ethical, how the sacraments are performed, etc. And of course, that didn't work. It didn't work. They thought that faith in faith, which and this is, again, I'm jumping ahead now, but later generations of scholars would say faith in faith caused religious wars, and it caused persecutions, and it caused all kinds of cruelty. Faith in reason was supposed to solve that by making everyone of one mind. And there's a funny period of time right in the generation following the original reformers that's sometimes referred to as the age of orthodoxy. Not our orthodoxy, okay, but the age of orthodoxy in Western European theological studies, in which these early churchmen, the followers of the original reformers, were convinced that they needed to lay out theology in such a way that they would all be able to agree on what was what. That up was up and down was down, and Jesus was Lord, and they were going to figure it out, and they were going to be they were going to fix Christianity. You see, we're going to fix the world. We're all going to have one church again, and we're all going to agree with our reason and with our faith in reason that it all is going to work. And so this age of orthodoxy is an attempt to use theological language to eliminate diversity. And it exacerbated diversity. It became known as a time where theology got really, really boring, because it was so dry and it was so cerebral, and they were wrestling so hard at trying to make this, we're all going to agree what all these things say. But the more they tried to agree, the more they splintered into different groups. Well, fast forward up into the 1970s, and we hit a point in the 1970s with Vatican II, and I'll give you some reading suggestions if you're really interested in some of this, but this is the Whirlwind Tour, where for many centuries the Roman Catholic Church have been guided on moral and ethical questions by really centuries, starting in the medieval era, of thinking and writing and manuals on what was ethical and what was moral, okay? They used the scholastic method, which was also influential in use in the age of orthodoxy, which is why theology got so boring, very separated from life. Well, what happened with Vatican II is they started rethinking all of these things. And they started really separating from the medieval expressions of Roman Catholicism. And the reason why this is important is you have to remember the hospital system in the West was largely Roman Catholic. Not all Roman Catholic by any means, but the Roman Catholics had a huge influence on the hospital system and the practice of medicine in our society. And in the 1970s, you start to get a flurry of challenges as far as what is ethical and what is not ethical to do. It's by no means the case that that's the first time we see challenges. We know, for instance, that, and here's another example of why it matters what direction we're pointing when we try to think of these things. In the early 20th century, we know that our own government experimented in eugenics. We know that they experimented. It seemed logical to them, it seemed natural that people with mental disabilities, people with hysteria, homosexuals, should be sterilized, right? Because they were using a frame of thinking. Forced sterilization said, really, the world doesn't need more people like you, so we'll solve that problem by making sure you can't have children. Now, this was by no means, not everybody thought that this was, or knew that this was happening, but it was happening. It was happening. So it's a question, it's an example of thinking in terms of medical ethics, thinking in terms of what is right or wrong. What can you and what can you not do to people and their bodies with their consent or without their consent, and what framework do you use to determine what's right or wrong? When you use a strictly Enlightenment framework and you can make the reason really clear, you can do monstrous things. That's the scary thing about the faith in reason. Reason leads us down a very, very much a damnation road. We've done horrible things to people because of the Enlightenment, not only because of the Enlightenment, because it proved to be ineffective. Okay? So what happens with ethics is there's a realization you've got Roman Catholic ethics, you've got Anglican ethics, you've got Lutheran ethics. There's Lutheran hospitals, there's Presbyterian hospitals, there's all these different hospitals, and there's all these different ways of thinking, philosophy, theology. How do we determine what the Bible actually says? How do we determine how all of that factors into what we do? And they realized they didn't have a unified vision for that at all. And this is actually the beginning of a search for a secular moral ethic. A secular moral ethic was going to solve the problem of religious theological diversity in determining what is moral and what is not moral, what is ethical and what is not ethical. It didn't start to try to tear down some Camelot era where we had perfect Christian morals in our country and everyone agreed on everything. That was not what motivated the search for a secular moral ethic. The search for a secular moral ethic said, if we can't agree because of all of our denominational and jurisdictional and confessional differences, we've got to try to boil all that down to a kernel that will then determine how we function. And this is largely, again, a question for hospitals. What do we do for people in their bodies? How do we determine what is right or what is wrong? What are acceptable practices surrounding pregnancy? What is acceptable practices for helping women get pregnant when there's some kind of impediment? There's a lot of different ways to think about that. The religious environment didn't provide unity on that, so they searched for it in a secular moral ethic, and it failed. That's why we're here. That's why we're where we are today. The search for a secular moral ethic did not achieve what they hoped that it would achieve. It simply opened up the landscape to more and more and more confusion. I'll point out a couple of books here that if you're interested in thinking about this and reading about this. These are both by a man named H. Tristram Engelhardt Jr., one of the foremost bioethicists of this era, and of immense reputation internationally in the field of medical ethics and philosophy and the use of medical ethics. He's also a convert to Orthodoxy. And he wrote a book that is in many ways, I read this book and I'm just flabbergasted at the things that he says in it. It's bonkers in all the best ways and the good ways. This is a book with a very textbooky title, The Foundations of Christian Bioethics. It's published by Schweitz and Zeitlinger. That's not an Orthodox publisher. It's really meant to be out there in the whole field of Christian ethics, chaplaincy programs. The difficulty with this book is it appears to be out of print. I actually had to I've heard about Engelhardt Jr. for many, many years. He's a Texan as well, by the way. And I think the last chapter in this book is Austin, Texas, the Fourth Rome, which only a Texan could possibly write such a thing. And the answer is no, Dr. Engelhardt. I don't think that Austin, Texas is the Fourth Rome. But in any event, this is a wonderful book, and it really, what's bonkers about it is that he is unapologetically orthodox, ascetical, spiritual, liturgical. And he says right here in this book, and here I'll loop in a little bit about why liturgical ethics, why Eucharistic morality. What Engelhardt would say is that because of this diversity, because of these failed attempts at trying to find a unified theory or a unified framework that would enable us to operate in the hospitals as well as in our personal sexual ethics, our family ethics, of how we raise our children. And we're going to spend a lot of time on children because that's a really hot button issue as some of the more combustible topics sort of filter down into what do we do with 12-year-olds that tell their teacher they're confused about their gender, and do you involve the parents, or do you start them down a path, and there's all this stuff, and of course, don't trust what you read in the media or watch in the media, because it's probably all wrong, but we're going to talk about that a lot. But what he emphasizes in here is that, first of all, the liturgical life is the framework, is the real, true Orthodox framework by which we really make all of our ethical, moral decisions. Historically speaking, whether or not we received communion was really the primary concern with our Orthodox decision-making on morals. If someone says, is it really that bad that I'm in a completely mutual, long-term, committed relationship that is going to culminate in marriage, but not for many years, and we're just going to be sexually active now, and we're going to live together, and we're going to do all these things, is it really that bad? And you could say, well, there certainly are a lot of things worse in the world, but the primary consequence of that is that for your sake, you shouldn't approach the chalice. That's what we're worried about. We're not worried about how bad it is. We're not worried about how much God just wants to destroy you like a little lantern fly, That's not our primary concern. Our concern is, what is your salvation? Our task is to always be uniting ourselves to Christ and always going down the path of salvation. So if someone says, is this really so bad? Well, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world, but what it means for us is that you should not approach the chalice if you cannot confess your sins to God with a clean conscience, that you're actually repenting of them, let alone if you don't really believe you're doing anything that's wrong. So that's the liturgical component of this. And what Dr. Engelhardt would say is Orthodox ethics and bioethics are liturgical, period. That is the framework, that's the primary way that we think of these things. The other book, and I'm going to read a couple passages from here as well, just to sort of wrap this section up. This is an easier book to get. It's recently published out of St. Vladimir Seminary, After God, Morality and Bioethics in a Secular Age. Neither of these is light reading. Don't buy them if it sounds like it might put you to sleep. It might. I mean, it's heavy stuff, but it's also important. So I would say more to those who actually are in positions to have to make really difficult decisions, particularly if you're in the medical field. You probably should have something from Dr. Engelhardt here. Let me see, what did I have here? There's a lot that I could read from you here. That's not what I wanted. What did I want? It's on page 12 or 15. Sorry, here. Yeah. This is a kind of a summary of the chaos that we're facing right now. Bioethics confronts a major intellectual and cultural failure of core expectations. It is now clear that there is no bioethics or morality that philosophy can establish as canonical. Which is a very postmodern thing to say, by the way, okay? And he's very well aware of what that means, because he says it often in here. But, modernity was faith in reason. Reason failed to give us that framework to think about these things, okay? There is no final secular view regarding the nature of the right, the good, and the virtuous. We could add the beautiful as well in there as one of the Socratic transcendentals. The Western moral philosophical project, begun in ancient Greece and re-embraced in the Western Middle Ages and in the Enlightenment, is now being acknowledged as a failure. As Judd Owen summarizes today, belief in the comprehensive philosophic teaching of the Enlightenment appears to lie in ruins, and few hope that any other comprehensive philosophy could successfully replace it. This despair is, to a considerable extent, due to a radical critique of reason as such, thus the postmodernism, for those of you who read in that area. The very sense and meaning of morality and bioethics must be rethought. It is impossible for secular moral reflection to establish a canonical content for morality because there is no way to step outside the various vocabularies we have employed and find a meta-vocabulary which somehow takes account of all possible vocabularies, all possible ways of judging and feeling. He's quoting Richard Rorty there. As the interminable debates regarding the moral status of homosexual acts, reproduction outside of marriage, abortion, healthcare allocation, and euthanasia demonstrate, we will be talking about all of those things, we do not agree when it is licit, forbidden, or obligatory to have sex, reproduce, transfer property, or take human life. We simply no longer agree on that. It wasn't long ago where really almost everyone would agree that euthanasia would be a really, really dangerous thing to employ. And now it's becoming very, very common for people to say, no, if you don't believe, here's another great example of why this is important. If you don't believe that your own personal suffering is redemptive, then there's no basis for not practicing euthanasia in your personal moral ethic, you see. We believe that suffering is redemptive because the cross stands at the center of Christianity. And we would be concerned with the taking of life artificially for any reason because suffering is redemptive. But if you don't believe that, is euthanasia wrong? Should it be legal? What kind of safeguards can we put on something like euthanasia so that in an environment of consent, where consent is the only thing that matters, whether you want your doctor to kill you with a lethal overdose of something, whether you want to have sexual acts of this or that kind, if consent is the only thing that matters, why not allow it all to happen? Well, that's kind of where we are. We've boiled it down to consent, and as we'll see, consent is a very problematic philosophical notion. So it is even impossible to secure a neutral philosophical standpoint that through sound rational argument can show that one should always act from the moral point of view. Among other things, there is no neutral moral point of view. The confrontation with such disappointments is the force of post-modernity. All right, so what's the point of all this? The point that I'm making, the point that he's making is that as Orthodox Christians, we actually do have a way of thinking. We do have a liturgical, ascetical life involving freedom from the passions that absolutely dictates and explains the entire teleology of our life in Christ. The direction, the orientation, the sense of fulfillment, the goal, all of that is laid out for us in the church, and it provides for us a very distinctive Orthodox way of life. And it is sound, it is logical, it is mystical, it is experiential. It is not based on simple draconian enforcement of authoritarian rule or law. It's based on the health and life of each person created in the image and likeness of God. And really what both of these books do is lay out the Orthodox framework for understanding ethics and morality. The question becomes, though, well, what about the non-Orthodox? What about the non-Orthodox? And this is, by the way, we haven't even mentioned things like what about other religions and their view of things, and why should the laws of the land reflect one type of morality but not another type of morality? This is the mess that we're in. You see, this is the mess that we're in. So we have to talk about it, and we have to talk about the fact that we're all kind of complicit in it simply because we're alive today. We can't escape this stuff. We can't escape how we were raised, and we can't escape how we've instinctively raised our own children, even when we really were given gifts by the church that we didn't fully utilize, and we have to really wrestle with what that means. So, what time is it? Okay, we're good. I could read a bunch from there, but I want to move on and talk about two frameworks. So the first framework that we're talking about, and this is the basic thing, if we don't have a Christian orientation, a Christian teleology, and for us as Orthodox Christians, one of the things that's really the thing about Orthodoxy is its sense of fullness. It's a pleroma, right? It's not lacking in anything. All the other Christian jurisdictions and denominations and communions, and I know this. I mean, I was an Episcopalian, and I can tell you there's many, many wonderful things about the Episcopal Church, and it's the history of Anglicanism. There's beauty in their music, and their churches are gorgeous, and the way that they sing their compositions. There's much there to laud and to love, but it's not the fullness that Orthodoxy has, precisely because it itself was born out of historical forces, okay? And that's true of all of the Reformation churches, and that's also true of what has happened to the Roman Catholic Church. We have a pleroma and a fullness in terms of how we understand what our orientation is. And it is a lived orientation. So I want to give 3 poles of our life. And the basic premise of this is that if we're missing any one of these, our ethics and our morality is going to be off. And the first pole I want to mention is death. Death is also going to be one of our transition zones in our other structures. So, and there's a lot of ethics around death and dying, and there's a lot of ethics around burial and how we think about how to pray for the dead. That's all wrapped up into all this. But think about death. And think about how many people have told you not to think ever about death. We are one of the most death-defying cultures in the history of the world. We've made sure that we don't think about death. And the problem with that is that we're all going to die. That would be fine if there was maybe an option, maybe a choice, like maybe I won't die and I could just live as if I'll never die. Nope, we're all going to die. Death is one of those things when I ask myself as a sort of moral, ethical pole or stage of orientation, my personal death should inform the way that I live my life. And unfortunately, we tend not to want to do that. And what's interesting about that, I have a print in my office. I've had it for many, many years. In fact, I've had it. We have to remember when and where we got the Mary Magdalene print. Oh, that's right. There was that Dutch exhibit in Fort Worth. Yeah, interesting. So for many, many years, I've had a print of a painting, a very famous Dutch painting called The Repentant Magdalene. And in that, this is very common, so I'm just sharing with you one example of this. And it's simply an image of Mary Magdalene. Of course, she looks Dutch, and it looks like she's living in the 1700s, because that's the way they did things. But she has her hand on a skull. And this was a very, very common thing, really from the Middle Ages in Western Christianity all the way up until the Renaissance, where it showed holy people really contemplating death. And sometimes it could almost take on a macabre thing. I was going to bring it down and show it to everybody, and I realized, the skull is so much in shadow that you can barely even see it. So me holding it up, and it's not very dark, light and bright in here, so I didn't even bring it down. But the point is, there's a tradition of contemplating death. And in fact, even in our own Orthodox tradition, many of the spiritual fathers of our faith tell us that one of the ways we live faithfully each day is that we spend time having what they would call salutary thoughts about our own death. Salutary thoughts about our own death. If I have to die in this body, I know that this body does not form the terminus of my life. I know that I cannot live for the body because the body will die and it will literally disintegrate and go into the ground. It doesn't matter if we pump it full of embalming fluids. It's just a matter of time. It's all going away. And who I am will be elsewhere, right? So if that's true, I can't live for my body today. I have to have an ethic that says if my body is going to go away, but my life is going to continue, and we'll come to that in a moment, because that's really the question of our own personal death, then my personal morality, my personal ethic must be greater than my body. My body must serve that greater vision. So there's two things to do here. One is to have salutary thoughts about your own death, is to have salutary thoughts about the limits, the mortality, the fleeting nature of whatever our bodily sensations are. And it's recognizing that we can be thankful for them for what they are, but we need to keep them where they belong, serving the soul, serving the nous, serving the mind or the intellect. Okay? And one of the images that I want to, well, let me just sort of do a sort of activity here. Think, one of the things we do for death row inmates is that when death row inmates are finally, after a very long legal process, are finally about to be executed, they get to have their final meal, and they are asked, "What would you like for your final meal?" And it's recognized as a kind of a mercy. If you have one last dinner to have, what is it that you'd like to eat? It's a very interesting question to think about if it was yourself. I mean, I'm sure we don't all think too much. Boy, if I'm on death row, what am I going to eat? But I think it's a good exercise to ask yourself, if you went to bed tonight and it was given to you in a dream to know that tomorrow you would wake up at your normal hour, your normal time, but that it was going to be the last day that you lived on earth, how would you spend that day? How would you spend that day? And let's make it like really even specific. At 10 p.m., you will expire. So here you are, you've got 14, 16 hours, depending on when you wake up. What are you going to do? And if we ask that question, another way of asking that question is, what do you really love? What do you think about missing? And I know this sounds macabre, but there's a purpose to this. What do you think about missing with death? What's the thing that you really would like, I'd have to do this? And this is where our personal morality lives, how we answer that question. You got one day to live, what are you going to do? That's where our morality lives. Because I know, of course, we're in a church, we're in our church, we know that there's religious answers to this. Oh, I'm going to go to confession, I'm going to receive communion, that will be my last meal. I'm not going to be thinking about steak or my grandmother's meatloaf or lasagna or whatever else popped into my head when I thought that's going to be your last meal. I want my last meal to be the body and blood of Christ. I want to spend the day praying. I want to call up some people and ask their forgiveness that I've never had a chance to do that. Maybe I want to walk in a meadow in the woods and just look at God's creation one last time. I want to spend time with my family. There's obviously good things that we all can choose right off the bat. This is how I want to spend my last day. But I also think it's helpful for us to be really honest with ourselves and really think about our attachments to the things that we love. How easy would it be for us to say, nah, I don't need that today. I don't need that today. Because as much as it's natural for us in our environment to think of spiritual, liturgical, ascetical things of simple joy and love and forgiveness and mercy, it's also really easy to imagine if we just instinctively, I want to rewatch all the Steelers Super Bowls. I want to be in that space one last time. I don't want to let that go. I want to do that, or I want to eat like all day long. I would just want to eat nacho cheese. All day long. I want to go to Kennywood and ride the roller coasters and have that thrill one last time. I mean, we fill in the blanks. We all have our stuff. We all have the things that we love. To what extent are we ready to say goodbye to those things? And here's another way of thinking of this question. If we lived that day the way that we really just wanted, if we just followed our desire and we lived it the way we wanted, Would that be a sustainable way to live every day of our life if it turned out that that was not the last day? And now the decisions you made on how you would live the last day of your life are going to be the way you live every day of your life. Would you be embarrassed? Would you be sickened by the food that you chose to eat? Steak is good, but try eating steak every day. You start getting sick of it, anything like that. Is your moral decision-making about these are the things that I would like to do sustainable, life-giving? Would it make you holy to keep doing those things every day for the next 60 years? And I think that's where we start to realize we've been given an incredible gift. We're not afraid of death, or we don't have to be afraid of death. Maybe we are actually afraid of death when it comes to our own death, but we have the victor over death. And we have a faith that says that our bodily death is not the end, and therefore we don't have to live as if we're going to live forever in this body. We should live as we will live forever with this soul and a redeemed body. And we'll get to that now in a second. Does that make sense to everybody? Why this is a good exercise and to have salutary thoughts about death. Because if I really think honestly about death, it really makes me think about the things that I really attach to and really loved. And then it makes me think about how I'm going to spend my day and what kind of decisions I'm going to make on that day. It's the same thing back in the nuclear scares, the atomic bomb scares of the 80s. Everyone had their thing, like what would happen if the sirens came, it's 1985, the bombs are already in the air, there's nothing we can do. What are you going to do? Because you know that is upon you. And how many people, I'm going to grab a six-pack and go up on the roof of my garage, crack open a beer, and watch the fireworks, And for a lot of people, that's kind of how they thought of it. We're all facing our imminent doom. Let's just have a cold brewski and, that's it. So I hope you realize I'm not doing something exceptionally weird or strange here. Having salutary thoughts about our imminent demise, about our death, really helps to frame our moral decision-making in terms of how I live my day now, and whether or not that day is a beautiful day. Truly beautiful in God's eyes. Isn't that a wonderful thing to think of, is that every day we have a schedule that's laid out before us, and parts of it we're in control of, parts of it we're not in control of, but what we have the power to do is to say, I'm going to make this day beautiful to God. I'm going to make this day beautiful to God. That's a moral life. How I make my moral decisions is going to be radically shaped by that. The other thing I'll say, the last thing I'll say about death is heavy. Death is heavy. When someone in our life dies, everything stops. People get on planes and they travel to be with you. We schedule viewings and services, and when you drive up the street, people have to stop and get out of your way. And I was telling the last funeral I did, we had to go way down 79 to the cemetery of the Alleghenies. Have you all seen the military cemetery down there for Joseph? And no, I'm sorry, that wasn't for Joseph. That was for Leon. And so it's difficult when you're navigating 79 with a funeral procession. But I told him in Texas has this interesting thing. In East Texas, when you're in a funeral procession, all traffic in all directions stops. Even on a highway, on the opposite side of the highway, they pull over and they stop. I was flabbergasted when I first saw this. I thought, I don't think this is safe, but it seems extreme. But it's an example. I mean, that's a sort of, an old world mentality. Death is heavy. And when we consider the heaviness of death, we ought to also have to realize that the heaviness of death is kind of like a ballast for our life. And if we're going to live a balanced, moral, ethical life, we want to make sure that our life is also as heavy as death. And that's a weird image because normally when we think of the spiritual life, we think of being light. We think of being free. We think of almost floating. But just as much as the light, the uncreated light of God, is so bright that it becomes darkness in our mystical theology, the heaviness of life becomes so dense and filled with life that it begins to float. And the ballast of death is balanced out. If we live a heavy life, we go right through death into the kingdom. And it's the simplest passageway we've ever known. But if we get the balance of this ballast off, then death becomes something that really is a terrible obstacle. And we face it as a terrible obstacle. So just think about that. Death is heavy. We have the freedom to make our life heavy with holiness, heavy with joy, heavy with love, heavy with forgiveness and mercy and humility. And when we're heavy with these things, death is actually kind of easy. So our own personal death and having salutary thoughts about death is one way we think morally, and we will continue to do this because death, as I said, also plays a role. It's got its own 2 sessions to think of end-of-life issues and why we have the teachings that we do about end-of-life issues and how we should live into those now. The next one I want to talk about, though, is what we profess in the Nicene Creed, which is that we believe that Christ will come again, that we believe in the resurrection of the dead, that we believe that even though my body will go into the ground and no longer be me, in a sense, nevertheless it will become me again. And that's a pretty striking thing to believe. That we are, and we're going to talk about this next week, we are made, well, we've talked about it a lot in the past, but we're going to talk about it in more detail next week. We are a body-soul unity. I'm not fully me if I'm not both my body and my soul. My body's going to die. My soul is going to live on in a different state, but my body will come back in a mystery. And we call that the eschaton. We call that the second coming of Christ. We call that the new heavens and the new earth. We also call it, I'll ask this as a question, what number in the days of the week is the telos, the eschaton? Which day is it? Yes, it's the 8th day. In other words, it comes in a succession to our understanding of reality as days. And the next question is, what is the 8th day of the week for us right now? Sunday. Yes, I was going to say, you definitely know this. Which means that if Sunday is the 8th day of the new creation, and we encounter that every week, and it's also the eschaton, the coming of Christ, the resurrection of the body, that means that our orientation to Christ as the Alpha and the Omega, our orientation to Christ who fulfills all things and fills all things with himself, is not something that we just, it'll happen someday, but I don't have anything to do with it now. Actually, we do. It's in like 4 days. That's the day of the Lord. That's the coming of the Lord. Anytime the church says, blessed is the kingdom of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, we are announcing the arrival of the eschaton. We're announcing the arrival of the 8th day. And the belief that our bodies matter, that matter matters, that our bodies have a telos, a teleology, and forgive me, let me just define that real quickly. Teleology simply means the study of the last things, all right, the eschaton. Teleology is where everything is going. It's what everything comes to completion in. So in our Christian teleology, we live that teleology on a weekly basis. And because our spiritual life is directed towards the Eucharist, that also means that we live it on a daily basis. So the end of time, the eschaton, the 8th day, the new heavens and the new earth, the fullness of paradise, forms for us a living reality. And it's within that living reality that we make decisions on how we live, that we make ethical decisions, that we face difficult questions. And again, I'm being general here, but we will look at difficult questions at the beginning of life and difficult questions at the end of life. We have to keep those two poles with us, all right? Because then that brings us to the third, and then we're going to wrap up here because it's been about an hour. But that also means then that every single day is the day of the Lord for me. Every single day is the day to have the salutary thoughts about death, to look ahead to the resurrection of the dead and the coming of Christ on the 8th day, which is the reception of the Eucharist for us, and to realize that the framework of my moral life, the framework of my ethical life, is laid out before me in the immediate now. And the biggest problem we run into in ethical and moral decision-making is when we erase those poles, the today, my personal death, the end of time. We erase those poles and we say, oh, you know, God, he's somewhere up there. I'm here. God wants me to be happy. And that means I should do what I want to be happy. And this is, I'm sure you have all heard of all this, but there's a sort of catchphrase that seeks to capture the spirit of the age. This is sometimes called moral therapeutic deism. Have anyone heard that before? No. Good. Has anyone heard of moral therapeutic deism? Okay, good. So, moral therapeutic deism. Let's breaking that down really quickly. Deism refers to this idea that there is a God. God wants us to be moral, righteous people, but God is also really absent. He wants us to manage things, and he wants us to be happy. Okay? And he wants us to define happy as whatever makes me happy. That's the therapeutic side of it, right? The therapeutic side of this is I should do what makes me happy. I should do what makes me feel fulfilled. I should always be pleased with my life. The point of my life is to please myself through therapy, okay? So that's the other side of it. And the moral side of it is again, the intense but strange morality of our age. This is a framework that is used to describe how a lot of people now, this is their philosophy. They might not even realize it's their philosophy, but it's their philosophy. God's far away. I should be happy, but I should also be a good person. And therefore, that's all God really wants of me, is to be a basically good person, which I've preached about that now twice in the last 3 weeks. Jesus is saying, don't be a terrible person, you know? No, that's not our framework. That's not our moral framework. But it is the popular one today. So when I start to lose the sense, when I start to ignore my own personal death, I start to live as if I'll never die. I'll probably make moral decisions and ethical decisions in a way that will be directly influenced by the fact that that's not a lived reality for me, et cetera, okay? So this is about orientation. And what Dr. Engelhardt mentions in both of these books, it's really the theme of his book. As Orthodox Christians, we have a liturgical, ascetical way of being that forms the matrix, that forms the framework within which we understand how we make moral decisions, how we make ethical decisions. And we have to realize that the world is suffering and it is deeply ill and sick because all the attempts that have been made to try to find a secular moral ethic have failed, and we were left with a kind of moral ethical chaos. Nobody can say anymore what is the basis for saying what is right or wrong, what is moral or immoral. Right? Another example of this, here I'm just quoting Dr. Engelhardt. If you follow the logic of moral therapeutic deism, and if you follow the logic of the dominant secular moral ethics, you would look at homosexuality and you would say that there is nothing that we can find in this that is immoral, perverse, unhealthy, confused, anything, right? In other words, that moral framework has declared this thing, homosexuality, now to be absolutely normal, maybe even good, evolved, okay? and it leaves us as Orthodox Christians looking like ogres, right? But we have a good reason why we think that that's not true. We have really good reasons why we think that's not true. I'm going to say this and then I'm wrapping it up, I promise. The next three frameworks then, and we'll pick this up next week and then talk about a theology of the body, is we're going to think about three transitions in life. The first transition is the transition from being a child to being an adult, which we usually define as, or historically that's usually been defined as, the time of sexual maturity. We don't see it that way anymore. When you consider how early puberty happens now, especially for girls, it's going to be decades before they become adults in our world. But traditionally, the transition from being a child to adult is when you hit sexual maturity, puberty. The church has a framework, a liturgical framework, for navigating that transition. And we will know how to act, and we will know what decisions to make if we take seriously that framework. The other moment is birth. And the interesting thing about birth is we can think about birth in a backward sense of my birth. What did my parents do when they had me baptized? What does that convey to me? Because at birth, we also have a whole series of liturgical, sacramental ways of navigating the transition of birth for the mother and for the child and for the whole family and for the whole community. We'll understand what's required of us morally and ethically at birth if we understand the sacramental liturgical heart of what's happening when a child is born into the world. So I can think about it backwards, my birth, but I also can think of it forwards, the birth of my child or the birth of my grandchild. In other words, it's not just a back then, it's an ongoing thing. And then the final one is death. And we also have liturgical, sacramental framework for thinking about death and what kind of death we want and what we do in death and how we pray for the dead. So those three things, the transition from childhood to adulthood, birth, and death, will form the framework for our course. And we'll spend two days each on each of those transitions so that we can speak at least somewhat in depth about the range of things that happen with sexual maturity, the range of things that happen with birth, and the range of things that happen with death. Okay, and let me say this next week. Make sure you raise your hand and stop me and ask questions and say, wait, I don't agree with that, or explain that, I'm not following you, or it's Wednesday night and I'm falling asleep. Let's stand up and stretch. This doesn't have to be an hour-long lecture, okay? So it can be discussion. So, all right, thank you all.